Alright, so we'll pick up with our next biome now, and that one's going to be that of broadleaf forest, which is one that's fairly relevant to us in Ohio because that's mostly the biome we find in this part of the world. So broadleaf forests and deciduous forests, like I mentioned I think in the previous section, are those that are going to lose their leaves once a year, and that's going to be in response to primarily temperature. There's other cues involved with the actual physical dropping of leaves, but primarily it's due to temperature, which triggers the whole thing. Temperate deciduous forests, broadleaf forests, are going to be in places where there is substantially more available precipitation than what we've seen in previous biomes. If we jump back a second and look, these temperate forests here are a big jump up. So far we've looked at tundra, boreal forest, grassland, savanna, and deserts. All of those are fairly low on the precipitation range, with the possible exception of boreal. Temperate forests, though, are a big jump up. So now we're going to go slightly warmer than some of those that we've seen, and quite a bit wetter than most of the ones that we've seen as well. So we talked before in the previous section about there are differences between like cold deciduous forests and drought deciduous forests. Drought deciduous forests are those that occur in places where there is a dry season, and cold deciduous forests are those that occur where there is a discrete period of wintertime where temperatures are cold. In these broadleaf deciduous forests, what you're going to find is that the midstory and the understory are very, very dark. If you go out into a forest around here in this part of the world early in the spring, there's plenty of light penetration, and those little plants that grow in the understory do really well and pretty much have to complete their entire life cycle during those few weeks before the bigger overstory trees get their leaves, because once that occurs, the understory is relatively dark, and it's going to be very, very difficult to get enough sunlight to eke out a living if you're an understory plant in that part of the world. Now, if we look at human threats to broadleaf deciduous forests, a lot of it's going to be habitat conversion, so removal of trees in order to build suburbs, urban sprawl kinds of things. Logging of trees also for timber. A lot of these trees are extremely valuable. If you look at really high value hardwood tree, there's a chance you might get $8,000 to $10,000 per tree if they're of a certain species and of a certain quality of that species. They can be extremely valuable. So obviously logging, habitat destruction, those kinds of things. Invasive species might be a little bit less of a concern so far in this part of the world, although there are certainly those examples out there. The emerald ash borer comes to mind specifically as one that's caused a lot of damage. If you've had ash trees in your yard or if you've had them in your neighborhood, there's a really good chance that by now they've died and maybe even have been cut because they were a risk to people's homes or safety or so forth. So there are certainly exotic species out there which could cause concerns in this part of the world. We've seen emerald ash borer, we've seen Asian longhorn beetle, gypsy moth, those kinds of things. But really, it's habitat destruction by people that is the primary danger to forests in this part of the world. The next one we're going to look at are Mediterranean forests. So now we're going to jump out here again on the warmer side of things, but we're going to drop back down in precipitation for just a moment. So Mediterranean forests, thorn scrub type forests, very, very dry, very, very hot. Again, this is sort of a drought adapted situation. So if you look on this graph, these forests are just slightly damper than a desert. They're wet enough that you do have some very, very scrubby, thorny, slow growing trees. Thorny because they want to protect themselves. If you have herbivores like this guy here, looks kind of sad for some reason. Herbivores come along and feed on those plants. If they consume a large volume of leaves from the plant, then it's also going to lose quite a bit of water in the process. And again, this is a really dry place, so you don't want to do that if you're a plant. So they're going to go to pretty extensive measures to protect themselves against herbivory. That's going to involve producing thorns and chemicals to help try to convince herbivores that maybe they should look elsewhere. Fire is a really common one. A lot of these plants, like I mentioned, have chemicals in their leaves or in their stems to help prevent herbivores from feeding on them. Those are often oils that are also very flammable. So once a fire starts, it tends to spread like, well, yeah, wildfire in that forest once it occurs, because these oils are very volatile and not really explosive, but they burn very, very quickly. Once a fire starts, the fires tend to be a bit more severe than most of the ecosystems we've seen so far. There's a conservationist by the name of E.O. Wilson, who's one of the more famous names in biology, still alive, quite advanced of age at this point in time, but he came up with the idea of what's called a biodiversity hotspot a few years back. And so This concept is one where you can have a lot of species crammed to a very, very tiny area. And so Wilson's idea was if you can pinpoint those habitats and protect them, that should be fairly feasible because we're only talking about protecting a small little area of habitat. We're not talking about protecting the entire Amazon. We're talking about protecting maybe a few hundred square miles, which is a little bit more feasible in terms of protection. And so as it turns out, a lot of these Mediterranean habitats are that. They are biodiversity hotspots that contain a large number of species in a small area. So there's been some interest in trying to protect these as sort of refuges or preserves or wilderness areas, because doing that would get you a lot of bang for your buck. You protect these areas, you protect a lot of species in the process. Fire, like I mentioned, is kind of a big thing. In these habitats, these plants are extremely flammable, and in some ways they're fairly similar to what you see in a desert. So we've got a picture here in the dry season, not a whole lot going on, a little bit of flowering happening here in the foreground, but then a few weeks later, after some rains come, now all of a sudden, it's not exactly the same location, but it's pretty close. Lots and lots and lots of wildflowers, and so everybody's trying to complete their life cycle while there's enough precipitation to make that happen. Otherwise, they're going to have to wait until this time next year to go through and get the rainfall they need. The next one we're going to look at are kind of your classic tropical rainforest type situations. Very, very hot, very, very damp. So now we're up here at the top. We're going from some of the warmest habitats to some of the wettest habitats. Also extremely, extremely rich in biodiversity. Tons and tons and tons of species. Lots of complexity in habitat. If you ever get a chance to go to a tropical rainforest, it's an amazing experience. You've got vegetation all the way down here on the ground. You've got vegetation going all the way up to the canopy, and you've got multiple layers in between, all kinds of vines and mid-story trees and epiphytic plants. Huge range of habitat complexity, so you can really get a lot of species into a fairly small area. Again, some of these could be considered biodiversity hotspots, and it's thought that maybe up to a half to two-thirds of all terrestrial plants and insects occur just in this one biome. So while there are some that may be as productive or nearly as productive as a tropical rainforest, most other habitats don't have the diversity that tropical rainforests have. They have that going for them, unique in that aspect. Many species in these places. So that's kind of a risky thing. If you have a lot of species all in one spot, if something happens to that place, if there's a logging event, if there's habitat destruction, if there's some sort of human disturbance, there's potential to affect a lot of species in that relatively small habitat. One of the things that's maybe a little bit counterintuitive about tropical rainforests is that they are actually fairly sensitive. Now, one of the things about them is that if you think about the conditions in a tropical rainforest, these tend to be around the equator. And if you remember our line way back at the beginning of the previous section, which showed temperature changes throughout the year, and it was like a flat line. Like temperature variation throughout the year, month to month, was like 1 or 2 degrees Celsius variation. Very, very little variation. These plants are not adapted to seeing changes in conditions. Living in the tropics is a very, very stable kind of environment. They've adapted to that. They're not really good at tolerating widespread, substantial, significant disturbances. So if something does happen, if somebody comes through and clear cuts a section of rainforest, those plants are going to have a really hard time coping with that. Another aspect about tropical forests is the soil is very, very low productivity. There's so much living biomass in the tropical rainforest that when something dies, it doesn't have a chance to break down and have its nutrients go back into the soil. The nutrients are going to be picked up by some other plant or fungus. They're pretty much immediately going to go right into the body of the next organism, and so there's not going to be enough time to see nutrients mixed into the soil like you'd see like in this part of the world or in a prairie ecosystem where the soil is very, very rich. In the tropics, the soil is terrible. So if you were to, say, cut down a forest and burn it, which is something we call that slash and burn agriculture, you cut down a chunk of forest, you burn it, that provides a little bit of ash to fertilize the soil for maybe a year or two of heavy agricultural use, and then you move on and do it again because the soil turns back and to garbage, basically. It doesn't work anymore after that point in time. The vegetation that's going to try to come back is not going to see much in the way of nutrients in the soil. And so recovering from slash and burn takes a really long time. These forests are not very resilient. They've got a lot of species, they're very productive, but when you start messing with them, they have a really hard time coming back from that disturbance. We have seen actually cases where rainforests have been protected successfully. There have been, we'll talk a little bit about this in the next chapter, there are Different types of conservation strategies. One of them is called a debt for nature swap. So a lot of these countries that have tropical rainforests are developing countries. They're almost third world type countries, and they actually owe a lot of money to the industrialized world. We have given them loans, we've given them aid, we've given them all kinds of help. And so one of the ways that we can help ensure they protect those tropical rainforests, because really you can't blame them for developing them. We've done that in our own country. We can't blame them for doing the same. But one thing we can do is we can say, okay, if you set aside a certain amount of area as a preserve or wilderness or some sort of protected area, then we are going to forgive X% of your debt, and you don't have to pay it back. All you have to do is say that you're not going to have any more development in that patch of rainforest, and the debt's forgiven. Part of the debt's forgiven, at least. So that's actually been fairly successful. There have been other conservation measures used as well that have been successful, but it's, again, a fairly delicate situation where we've got a lot of species in a small area, relatively small area, that are very sensitive to disturbance. And if things aren't handled properly, then a lot of those species might go extinct in the near future. Even in more northern regions, we can also find what are called cloud forests. And so these tend to be places, kind of like these pictures here show you, where a lot of precipitation actually comes not so much in rainfall form, but in the form of clouds and dew and very moist, humid air. They almost produce a similar kind of environment to a true tropical rainforest. Very diverse, very structurally rich, very rich in biodiversity as well. But we can see those further away from the equator. You don't have to travel quite as far away from Ohio to get to a cloud forest as you would, say, a rainforest. If you want to go to rainforest, you're going to, South America. Cloud forest, a little bit closer to home. There are some even in parts of California. There are some in Central America where you're not looking necessarily at a true tropical rainforest, but something similar because of the conditions they have there. The next one we're going to look at on land, and actually I think the last one we're going to look at on land, is a tropical dry forest. And these are much less famous than tropical rainforests. They're not as widespread. Most people have never heard of a tropical dry forest, but as it turns out, they can be as diverse and productive, or more so, than a tropical rainforest. They can have as many species, they can be as productive, even though they can either be either evergreen or drought deciduous, because they're not getting the rainfall all year like a tropical rainforest does. If we jump back a second, tropical rainforests, they're getting a huge amount of precipitation every single month of the year, up to this number right here. That's 2.6 meters of water per year, right, in rainfall. That's enormous. That's more water than most people are tall, right? If you're 6 feet tall, you're roughly like right around 2 meters in height. This is 2.5 meters in height of water per year. Tropical dry forests aren't getting anywhere near that much water, but they're still very, very productive. And in some cases, they're actually threatened more than tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests, aside from slash and burn agriculture, really aren't touched as much by people. There's a lot of road building. There's some slash and burn going on, quite a bit actually. Tropical dry forests, though, are impacted more because the soils are a bit better. You can grow stuff in them. You can have agriculture in places that used to be tropical dry forests. Because they're more arid, there also aren't as many insects, so you don't have the issue with malaria. You don't have issues with sleeping sickness and those kinds of things. Sleeping sickness, Chagas disease, those kinds of things as well, because it's not as wet. And so for people to kind of get in there and colonize tropical dry forests is a much easier proposition than it would be for a tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforests, even if you slash and burn, you're only going to get a couple years out of growth for a ton of work you put into it. Tropical dry forests, you can cut those down and burn them, and the soil's pretty decent. You can grow on that land for several years. So we see a lot of impacts in tropical dry forests, converting those to agriculture and so forth. So next up, we're going to look at marine ecosystems. And again, by marine, what we mean here is saltwater or ocean habitats. It's huge, right? This is by far the biggest biome of any of them, especially terrestrial and freshwater. Marine ecosystems are extensive. And so you might expect this might be a fairly substantial contribution to overall productivity and biodiversity in the world, but in fact, that is not true. I mentioned before in the previous section toward the beginning that most ocean ecosystems are not that productive because once you get below, a meter or two of water, there's not enough sunlight to support much photosynthesis, and if you don't have much photosynthesis, you're not going to have much animal life, and so productivity and therefore biodiversity are pretty low in the ocean. The one exception to that would be in coastal areas. Shallower, you've got nutrients coming in from the land. Those places, coastal habitats, wetlands, estuaries, those kinds of places tend to be very, very rich and productive. but open ocean habitat tends not to be. The other thing about the ocean environment is that we know almost nothing about it. You'll often hear it said that we actually know more about the surface of the moon than we do the bottom of our own ocean. Or even not even the bottom, but the mid-level of our own ocean. We know very little about it. So there's a lot out there waiting probably to be discovered. In terms of importance, obviously it's huge. I mean, historically, for transportation, for human food, right? Much of the Earth's population, human population, is supported by the oceans in the form of seafood of various kinds. So it's very important there as well. Oftentimes in these marine ecosystems, what we'll find is the base of the food chain is not a plant. There actually aren't that many marine plants. But what they are algae kinds of things, protist kinds of things. So diatoms and dinoflagellates and those kinds of even single-celled microscopic photosynthetic organisms that are part of what we call the phytoplankton. Now, phytoplankton, first off, plankton, it just means anything floating in the water. Right? Aside from the little guy from SpongeBob, plankton means anything small and living floating in the water. It could be baby fish, it could be algae, it could be animal-like protists, it could be eggs of things or dispersal stages of things. Anything small enough to just kind of float in the water and be at the mercy of the currents is called plankton. Phytoplankton is photosynthetic plankton. So the phytoplankton tends to be the base of the food chain or base of the food web. From there we move into what are called zooplankton, which are animal-like protists. So we go from plant-like protists to animal-like protists. And then from there we start getting into small fishes and then bigger fishes and so on. And more recognizable, familiar kinds of marine life than maybe some of those plankton sorts of things are. Coastal areas, like I mentioned, are very, very important. The nutrient influx, you've got rivers dumping into the ocean, you've got warmer temperatures, shallower temperatures, tend to be the most productive. This is also where you find coral reefs, which are some of the most productive and most diverse, second only to tropical rainforests. Coral reefs are the second most diverse habitat on the Earth. We'll talk about those here soon too. But currents are also very important. Currents are important in supporting life on land, believe it or not, because of circulation patterns of water, warm water going from the equator up toward more northern latitudes. So if you were to look at the ocean current going from the equator up along the Atlantic coast up here into the North Atlantic and then back down again, that's what keeps our part of the world habitable. If that were to stop or if that were to change, it would be nearly impossible to live in this part of the world because it would be so cold. It's kind of hard to imagine that, but an ocean current actually helps keep us at a moderate temperature level in this part of the world. So very important there, not only for temperature, but circulating nutrients and circulating oxygen, those kinds of things. When it comes time to think about recycling, there's also a decomposer aspect to the marine ecosystem. There are all kinds of things that live even on the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean that are going to start breaking down the dead things that fall down from above. There's sort of this ongoing process of almost like snowfall in the water, but it's dead and decaying organisms, which sounds kind of gross, but it's really important for getting nutrients recycled on the bottom, either turned back into or recycled into the sediment or taken up into the bodies of fish that then swim back up to the surface or near the surface. A lot of recycling going on in the ocean as well. Vertical stratification is less of an issue in the ocean than it might be in a freshwater habitat like a lake, but we do still see this. Deep ocean water is very different from shallow ocean water. The light penetration is almost none. If you've ever done any scuba diving or even snorkeling, once you get down below a few feet of water, it starts to get pretty dark pretty quickly. I've been down to 115 or so feet in water, and it's quite dark and actually very cold as well. So it's difficult to make a living even in 100 feet of water, much less several hundred or even several thousand feet of water in deep ocean. Photosynthetic organisms aren't going to have a chance at that depth, and most other organisms won't either. The things that do live down there are things that are deep ocean specialists, things that live around thermal vents and utilize chemicals from the Earth's crust to not photosynthesize, but do other forms of autotrophism to make their own food. So the open ocean is sometimes referred to as a biological desert because there is really not that much diversity out there. Once you go below the first few meters of water, there's not much out there in the ocean. There's a few things down deeper, but in terms of comparing things to on land, it's not even close. If we look at some different ways to describe a body of water, the benthos is the bottom part. So if you're talking about benthic organisms, those are organisms that live on the bottom of the ocean or bottom of a lake, even in that case. Pelagic means open water. So they're not living on the bottom, they're actually living up in the water column somewhere. The pelagic zone is where you find most organisms in either an ocean or a lake. We've talked about the low productivity before. There are places in the world that are very productive. The Sargasso Sea is one that actually has its ocean, but it's still got a really high productivity. Otherwise, you're looking at coastal regions to find productivity in the ocean environment. And we've talked about deep sea thermal vents as well. That helps keep things warm and also provides chemicals to organisms. The other issue here is pressure, because if you think about the amount of air pressure, like the amount of air pushing down on your head and the force that exerts at sea level, we refer to that as one atmosphere. All right, so if you're standing on land at sea level, there's a certain amount of atmospheric pressure pushing down on your head. And that atmospheric pressure is the result of several miles of air pushing down on your head. Don't get all claustrophobic. It's okay. You'll be all right. But there's air pushing down in your head that creates atmospheric pressure. That's from several miles of air. If you go down 10 feet of water, 10 feet of water is the equivalent of one atmosphere. If you go down 20 feet, now you're equivalent of 2 atmospheres. Plus the one on land is 3 atmospheres. So you don't have to go down very far until you start to feel some fairly intense pressure, right? So if you're snorkeling, if you're scuba diving, you know you have to equalize the pressure, because otherwise the difference in pressure in the inside of your head versus the outside of your head becomes very painful. And so you have to equalize it by kind of pinching your nose and trying to blow out through your ears, and that will take care of it. But otherwise, if you're starting to get down in the realm of hundreds or thousands of feet, the pressure could be enough to cause severe damage to the body of most organisms. So pressure is another challenge to deal with in the deep ocean. And again, just to kind of remind you, most of the ocean here, very, very dark blue. Not much in the way of productivity unless you're equatorial, unless you're around the coast, unless you're in very shallow water. Productivity and diversity are very, very low. These are some of those, to us, what seem to be fairly bizarre deep water ocean thermal vent organisms. Different bivalves, different microscopic organisms. These are thermal vents. You can see kind of this plume of water coming out from a vent here and also over here. There's going to be organisms that live around that take advantage of not only the temperature and the steam, but the chemicals coming out as well. And then from there, that's kind of the base of the food chain. From there, we start seeing other organisms living around that. All right, so we're going to stop here, and I will pick up one more section on biomes, and then we'll be moving into nutrient cycles and energy flow in ecosystems.